racing. I am editing the video today, but we actually did it the last 2 days just for a couple hours a day. We rebuilt this ZF S5-42, so it's a late square body Ford 5-speed. You could have get it behind a diesel, big block or small block, so it would be a different bolt pattern for each one. Unfortunately, I don't know why Ford does that. They always have, but that's what they do. Anyway, it's not hard. It's not hard. It does require a couple special tools, one being bearing puller, a 3-jaw puller, and a case of beer so you can get a friend over to help hold stuff. That's it. There's a lot of special tools they sell for it, and I think that's for people that don't have friends. So if you don't have friends, maybe you'll need to be either more creative or you'll have to get some special tools. It isn't hard to put them together. You can take them apart, let them just fall apart, and don't even worry about it. The exploded view shows you how to put it together. Any part that you can't tell, obviously, in the exploded view which direction it goes, conveniently is labeled. This goes to the front or this goes to the rear. That's what it says right on it, on the parts. So it isn't hard. Don't sweat it. Don't look too far into it, or you'll just think it's impossible to do. I promise you it isn't. If you've rebuilt a Muncie, you can rebuild this one. A little bit more parts on that, but they're not nearly as cumbersome as a Muncie is inside with all the needle bearings and stuff falling out. You don't have to worry about with these. They're all caged, kind of like more like a Super T10 would be. It is a little trickier. That's why you need the friend over. Like a Muncie and stuff's easy to do by yourself. This one, it does help having a friend just to hold things, spread them apart while you put them together and stuff like that. I mean, but special tools, bearing puller, 3-jaw puller is all we use, and then a bunch of tubes of different sizes. You know, if you have, you know, tubes, and we used exhaust tubes for a lot of it, just different size exhaust tubes, just tap stuff together. And that's it. So anyway, stay tuned, check it out. I'll show you how we get it so clean and everything. We really cleaned it. We used our tank. Awesome, man. We rebuilt the whole thing on this table. This thing did not need to be rebuilt, by the way. It would have been fine the way it was. It almost was a shame rebuilding it. Here we go. First things first, we're just going to get rid of this PTO that was on the side of it. It came out of a wrecker just like mine, but we're not going to use that. I may have it rebuilt and use it later. Right now we're still running a belt drive one, and it actually works so well that I'm not going to change it. So we'll just cover that hole back up when we go to put it back together. Now we're just you can't see what we're doing, but we're just taking the shifter off, and there is one little plate and a spring, real simple. You got to take off. Just be careful when you're taking that shifter off, because it could go flinging on you and maybe fall in. And while I sit there and remove the studs, Shane's kind of just inspecting it and trying to see how we have to go about taking it apart. You know, we're kind of going into this blind, so we don't really know what to expect. Here's where we discover the detents for the shifter. I don't think you really need to have them out, those 3 little freeze plugs out when you take it apart, but to put it back together you will need to have them out. And I just used just like a stud puller with a screw in it. So I drilled a little hole and then screwed the screw in and pulled them out. They actually come out really easy, a lot easier than you would think they would come out. And here's where we discover you have to have it basically tail shaft down to pull it apart. Otherwise you're going to be lifting that entire assembly out all as one unit. So we just took it out that way, and it's actually really easy. You just pull the housing off around it. And now here we just put a ratchet strap and tied everything together to pull it out, and we don't end up putting it back together that way. That was a trick that was online, and it's not really a worthwhile trick. But to take it out, I think I'd do it again that way. But when we put it back together, we do it different. There's just too much risk involved in doing it that way, putting it together. And now here comes our first bearing that we have to pull off, and this is where I discover that I don't have a bearing puller that's exactly the right size. I kind of have one too small, and then I have one too big. There's not one in between, so we end up getting real creative on getting this thing off, but we got it. And here we used a little bit of heat to heat the bearing up just a little bit, because it seemed like it was so tight on there and we weren't in an ideal situation. We're not reusing the bearing, so I wasn't too worried about heating it up, and that made it come off a little bit easier. And now, of course, all the parts are kind of being a bugger to get off of there, but we got them all off. I don't know if that'll be a normal thing, but this transmission has had such light use, it appears that everything on it was really tight. Even the stuff that should just slide off on splines was really tight. And here now we're using a little tiny gear puller and pulled that front bearing off. That one went as planned. What I'm doing when I keep bending over down there, I put a board with a piece of aluminum on the ground, and I'm actually just using inertia to get those parts off. I'm just kind of dropping the shaft straight on there and letting the part, like, the inertia of the part stopping, slide the parts off instead of trying to use pullers and stuff on it. Most likely yours will come apart a little easier. This one being in such light use, it just, everything was so tight. And this gear, you do have to, I believe you always have to pull that one off with a 3-jaw, and that comes right off with 3-jaw as well. Those bearings and stuff that you keep seeing pop out on the slides, you can buy those in addition. They don't come with a rebuild kit, but I would buy them new if you can. They're really inexpensive. You'll need, I believe it's 4 sets for this transmission, and I would just go ahead and buy them. That way you don't have to worry about losing the parts and stuff. When you take those off, they just go shooting everywhere. And now this is where this table really shines. I flipped the valve, so when we took it apart, we actually let it just drain. I don't know how much of that comes through on the video and time lapse, but we just let the oil just pour right out, and I had the valve switched to the waste bucket. And then after it drained all the way into the waste bucket, I flipped the valves, and now we're just on recirc and using the parts washer part of it, all on the same table, which is pretty cool. All right, and while Shane finished cleaning them up, I went upstairs and printed off some exploded views that I found online just by searching ZF S5-42 exploded view. A bunch of them will come up, and you can print off whatever ones you want to whatever ones look best to you. And then we just start tapping everything together with, that was a piece of exhaust tubing. You should never have to beat on anything, just tap it in. We use petroleum jelly to hold everything kind of together on as far as the synchro springs and balls and stuff. That way stuff doesn't go flinging across the place, hopefully, and it at least doesn't go too far, because that stuff's kind of sticky, and then the ATF, once it gets on there, just dissolves it out, so it doesn't create a problem later on. This is where having 2 people is really helpful, especially sliding those synchro the slides down over the balls and the springs and everything. You got to hold them all while you slide them in, and just watch your fingers, because it will cut you pretty good if you slide it down too quick. So you just get the ring just over the balls, and then watch your fingers, because once it goes, and then it'll pinch your finger. And I don't think blood makes the best lube for the inside of a transmission. I could be wrong. It's the right color, but I don't think it's the right fluid. And creativity again, just finding something the right diameter that you can tap stuff on with, and then just oiling everything up with ATF as we go. What we're looking at here is it wasn't really clear which way that the synchro slide thing goes on there. The inside part, I don't know what that part is actually called. But what happens is when it has the bevels, the 3 beveled grooves on the inside, that always goes towards a bearing. And so just put them on that side towards the bearing. That part wasn't labeled what side it went to, but it is a general rule that it goes towards like one of those sleeve bearings. Not the bearing we're tapping on there, but the bearing that is underneath the gear prior to it, below it there. Here we're just going to change the seal in the input shaft. That seal keeps oil in the input bearing that's on the one that we just tapped on that shaft. That oil keeps, or that seal makes the oil just stay in there, so that thing's kind of in its own, has its own oil supply, so the oil works its way in there, and then it just can't really drain out. That way when you start your car when it's cold and you're not actually driving the rig, if it's just sitting there idling, you're warming it up in the morning, that bearing's not just sitting there running dry. It has its own oil that stays in there. So that seal is very important. Otherwise, if that seal wasn't in there, the transmission would work fine, but the bearing on the back of the input shaft there would wear out fairly quickly in the mornings when you're starting the thing up. And here's something that I get that if you're not super familiar with the transmission, you're going to end up having to do. We're taking it back apart a little bit. When we put the synchro on, I covered up the holes. The synchro can fit on two ways, and I didn't pay attention to it, and I covered up the holes that the springs and the detent balls go in. I covered them up, so I had to just index it over one. So, and unfortunately, you have to take it all the way back down to it, so that you can change it. Okay, and we put the top sleeve on. Don't put that one on. That's the 3/4. Don't put that one on yet, because as you assemble the other side, if you're doing it in the same order we're doing it, it'll fall off on you. And then all your parts go flinging out of there. And that happened to us. So just leave that one off for now. So now we took the cases outside and I sprayed them down with degreaser. Let it soak for a bit and then pressure wash it off just like you normally would. Make sure you don't have any parts or anything that you're going to blast out of it and lose. And remember the detent pins from the shifter that were underneath those three plugs that we pulled out with the dent puller. Remember those pins are still in there, so just make sure you don't lose them. And anyway, so I pressure washed it off, dry it. As dry as you can get it. I just blew it off with my leaf blower, and then I'm spraying aluminum brightener on. You get it from Napa, and if you ask for it, they actually sell it in a gallon. They don't usually have the gallon out on the floor, but they usually have it in the back. You buy it in the gallon, and then just spray it on there, and basically just keep it wet until as soon as you spray that stuff on there and it foams. It should just foam up right away. If it's not foaming up right away, you're not through the contaminant in that area. And don't ever let it dry on there. So just spray it on. Once it gets to the point where you're going around that and everything you spray just instantly foams up, then you're good to go. Pressure wash it off and you're done. All right, and so after I changed my clothes because I was soaking wet, and that's just what kind of happens when you do that. Shane kind of dried everything off and got it all ready, and he put seals in the case in the case halves. And then now we're just gonna keep going on assembly. And basically you just assemble it at this point in the reverse order you took it off, except we're not going to use the ratchet straps like we did when we took it apart. I don't know if people are actually trying to put them together that way or not, but that's just a dangerous thing to do, because you could knock the shift slide off of the 3/4 really easily. In fact, I think it'd be almost impossible to get that in there without knocking that 3/4 shift slide off while you're putting it together. So anyway, so now we're just going to get, again, creative with things and tapping all the parts together. It is really easy with that exploded view, and now that you know that all the parts that are questionable are actually labeled, it's real easy to put it back together. So we're putting the shafts in, one at a time, and then we're knocking the roll pins out of the shift fork slides, and then we'll actually put them together on there and knock the roll pins back in. That's a really easy way of doing it. They make a special holder so that you could do it not doing it that way and put it together in a unit. But that way works really well. It's really easy to do. It's not hard at all. The hardest thing is the bottom. You can see us with the bottom. The bottom roll pin is a little bit hard. You just had to have Shane hold it up a little bit while I tapped it in. That's really the only tricky part about it. All right, and now as I finish up those shift forks, there is the plate, and I didn't show you the plate because the camera was too low, but it's down there where it's held on by 3 shoulder bolts, where the 4 shift rail things go in there, the shift fork rails. That thing, it should be floating. It's not supposed to be tight. It's supposed to be able to move around, and that's basically just a lockout, so it doesn't accidentally go into 2 gears at the same time. But that thing, it's just sitting on shoulder bolts, and you just tighten the shoulder bolts around it, and it should just wiggle around a little bit. The holes are oversized. And then just slip the 2 halves together, and there's the dowels, so everything will line up, and you'll have to pull that part together. But you should be pretty close together, about a 1/4 inch apart, before you start driving bolts into it. Making sure that you got the rails on the other side in the holes that they go in. And then just drive that seal in. You got to go in deeper than you think. Just make sure the yoke isn't bottomed out on it when you put the yoke on. And there's the sleeve on this thing between the yoke and the back bearing there. There's a sleeve. Don't forget that. Otherwise, that gear can pop off of there. So anyway, that's it. Now we're just doing the simple stuff. Put the shifter in and put that spring and the plate on the shifter. Don't forget that. But ours worked out perfectly.
Keep in mind that now that you have new synchros and stuff, it is not going to spin super easy in like first, second, third gear. You're not going to be able to just turn it real much. All those synchros are going to be dragging a little bit. You should be able to move them, but you probably won't be able to do it by hand. You might see, and you can see there we have vice grips on it, and it shouldn't be super hard, but there should be some drag, or there will be some drag on it. It's not going to spin real easy like it did when you take it apart. It will. After a couple hundred miles driving it, it will spin easily as those synchros wear in. It's the inside grooves on the synchro that they create drag like that when you first put them together. And it should have some drag. Otherwise, there's it's something's wore out and it's sloppy if you first put it together with new synchros and it doesn't have any resistance at all. So that's that. Thanks for watching. I hope this video was helpful or at least entertaining, if nothing else. And this is just a pretty basic, more on the complicated side transmission to rebuild, but don't be intimidated by it. As long as you're patient, you got the time, you can do it. It's real simple to do. I would not be intimidated by doing these, and you don't need this fancy table and stuff. You can do it all the hard way. It's not just on a bench or even a Rubbermaid table you could rebuild this thing on. It's not too terribly heavy. So anyway, thanks for watching. We'll see you next week. I'm already working on the doghouse for the Safari wagon, so that's going on right now.